Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be back again. I gave a talk on dreams a few years ago at Lincoln. Some of you were there. So it's fantastic to be back again. Now, last night when Denise was talking, she mentioned the issues about falling asleep during a talk, particularly after dinner. Now, we don't have that excuse, but fortunately, if you fall asleep during this, it's entirely legitimate because you can say that you are doing your own research into dreaming. So, be great. Hopefully, what the children have to say will keep you awake, though. So, I wonder how many of you take notice of your dreams, whether that be most of your dreams or whether it be nightmares, which can't be ignored, or whether that might just be very occasional dreams that seem quite different and stand out from others. Neuroscientists have calculated that the person who sleeps an average of 8 hours a night, if you put all of the time that you have spent dreaming together by the age of 50, you would have spent 5 years of your entire life in the dream state. So it seems to me that that's scientific evidence enough just to take a bit more notice of your dreams if you don't already. Now, childhood. Again, I wonder how many of you think about your childhood. Perhaps, certainly I think as I've got older and friends in a similar position, we find that we do think back to our childhood more and start to realise how important it was in shaping our spiritual lives, even if at the time we didn't particularly notice it. That was me, and well, when I became a primary school teacher, I was very fortunate that my father still is, was an amateur photographer, so we've got lots of childhood photographs. My parents tell me that I always pointed to things rather than shaking my finger. The things I was pointing at were often, I think, quite kind of spiritual type things. I was always interested in the unseen, hence the word in my title. I also keep reminding my parents still that I was the perfect child, just in case they forget. But I was one of those children who you never had to tell to go to bed. I knew what my bedtime was, and I would go upstairs to bed without being told, always early, because I love sleeping and dreaming, even though, as most children do, they've had nightmares at times. Now, Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst you'll be familiar with, he talked about dreams that sometimes occur in childhood, and he called them big dreams. And these are dreams that often have some very profound impact on a person. They can occur in adulthood as well, often at times of stress. And these are dreams, big dreams, that have often a very intense vividness, something quite distinctly different from your normal dreams, most of which, of course, you can very, very easily relate to your daily life. And it's those big dreams that I'll be talking about today. So, a little brief history for you of spiritual dreams, which predate Christianity. In most ancient civilizations, we found evidence of dream incubation temples. So from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, over in China as well. And these were temples that people would travel many, many miles to often when they had a problem. Now, it was usually quite often a health problem. So, for example, in ancient Greece, the god Asclepius, who was the god of healing, had many temples built for him for the purpose of dream incubation. So dream incubation is where people would undertake rituals, and they would pray for the gods to come into their dreams to give them an answer to their problem. And as I say, this was a practice throughout the ancient world. Some dream incubation temples would have a dream interpreter there. So a person would perform their rituals, make clear what their question was, why they needed the gods to come to them in their dreams. And in the morning, they would talk to the temple interpreter, say, this was my dream. And often the interpreter would tell them what the message from the gods was. And because of that existence in the ancient religions, Wendy Doniger and Kelly Bulkley certainly proposed that the very original area of field of dream research was actually religion, whereas we today might more commonly put it into psychoanalysis with Freud and Jung, who made dream interpretation kind of more popular. But it's not just something that was confined to ancient religions, because we have the same concepts in the Bible, in the Quran as well. The New Age, of course, has also focused on spiritual dreams, as has the mind-body-spirit movement. And there are lots of people today who, artists, for example, musicians, who say that they get this kind of spiritual inspiration for their work through their dreams. So let's take a look at the specific type of dream that we'll be looking at, often called a divine dream. And that can be a dream in which God is present. So, as I say, those kind of dreams that we saw in the dream incubation temples, but also dreams we see in the Bible. For example, the dream of Solomon, where God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "Ask, what shall I give you? I give you a wise and discerning mind. I give you also riches." So we have people who report dreams in which God appeared. And the other type of dream is a dream in which there isn't necessarily an appearance of God, but it's a dream that has a divine origin, which is sent by God or Allah. So Islam in the Quran talks about Allah sending true dreams alongside other dreams with different origins, such as origin of the mind. And Pharaoh's dreams, which you'll be familiar with, are in the Quran as well, as you may well be aware, as well as in Genesis. So, for example, Pharaoh's dream of 7 lean cows eating 7 fat cows, which was interpreted as interpretation that there will be 7 years of famine. So, inherent in those kind of dreams then is the notion of interpretation, that you're going to need to understand, firstly, perhaps this is a message from the divine, but what that message is needs to be discerned. So we have our biblical dream interpreters. Daniel was another one, of course. And theologians have looked very carefully at Old Testament and New Testament dreams, and they describe two different types. One is an auditory message, where you literally in your dream hear a message spoken to you in words. And secondly, where you see an image, but that image needs interpreting. And as I said, of course, psychoanalysis has kind of largely owned these kinds of dreams in the West and given quite different interpretations. Freud, for example, might have said that if you dream of God, then it's an issue with your father figure. So whether these dreams are divine or not is not so much the question for me. The question for me is what is the meaning for the person who has it, and whether that's an adult or a child. But certainly there are dreams, and we'll come on to them later, that don't tend to have the message hidden in words or hidden in symbols, but they are, and there'll be these dreams that appear to predict the future, dreams that just appear to be quite literally presented. Now, in most cases then, and when you read books and literature on dreams and spiritual dreams, over and over again, it's about adults' experiences during adulthood. There are some references to adult recollections of childhood dreams, certainly, but any kind of studies, interviews tend to be with adults. And I wondered whether, as Pauline said, a lot of children's divine encounters are very similar types of experience to what adults had. But really, I couldn't find much in the literature at all, apart from Robert Cole's American psychologist, who did some really interesting talks with children, not about dreams, it was about their spiritual lives, but yet the children would offer stories about divine dreams without him prompting them. But there weren't really any systematic studies. Now, I was a primary teacher for about 9 years, and I was responsible for religious education. And I saw very much there something, in a sense, Pauline was referring to, that if you give children the space to talk about spiritual experiences, they're very comfortable with doing so. And they will talk about death and bereavement very openly, and it's often the adults who can't deal with it. But you give children the opportunity, which I used to do in RE. One day I was sitting in the classroom with my 8 and 9-year-olds, and we were talking about children's encounters with God. And I'd done this as an RE lesson every year, so we heard very kind of similar stories. So children would say that when the leaves rustled, that was God talking to them. Children might say things like they would look up in the sky in the clouds and they would see pictures, but it was God in the clouds. But then I heard a story, and it was the first time I'd heard it mentioned about dreams. And a 9-year-old boy said to me, "Oh, Miss, I see God, but it's not like the others have just said. I see God in my dreams. He comes to talk to me then." And that had quite a profound impact on me, because I then did a small study for the Farmington Institute at Oxford University to explore this further, which then led on to a PhD in it. So my whole life changed and went down this route. So I had a 9-year-old boy sitting there telling me that God communicated with him through his dreams. And that fits beautifully, of course, into this long historic religious traditions of dreams being a form of communication between people and the divine. So my first study for the Farmington Institute at Oxford was a little pilot study, really. I asked 66 children, aged 9 to 11, if they'd ever had a dream that they thought had God in or might have had a divine origin. And these children at this point were just Christian and secular backgrounds. And just over a fifth of them in their questionnaire said yes. They'd had probably one. And this is, we're only talking about a very small number in every single case. I have to say that was a bigger percentage than I thought, but it obviously a very, very small study, and we don't make generalisations. The University of Glasgow education faculty was very forward thinking, and then later they'd liked that pilot study and they gave me a full-time PhD scholarship. And this was a much bigger study that also involved Muslim children and children who kind of said, well, they were kind of Christian, but kind of not. So we called them marginal Christian. There were only 9 of those, as it happened. So I gave out 478 questionnaires, again just saying, have you ever had a divine dream? And again we see around a fifth coming back, and these were schools in Scotland and England. They were all spread out geographically. And then I did a massive 94 single interviews with children who said that they'd had one of these kind of dreams. Sometime after, some colleagues in South Africa, Potgieter et al., did a small study but replicated my work. And again, they found in South African children the same proportion, that about a fifth of children said they'd had probably one of these kinds of dreams. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't know any children that have ever had any dream like this, I think as we go through, we might kind of try and tease out why that might be. And it may well be that they just haven't felt, Pauline has said, hadn't felt able to share for various reasons. So I'll give you some examples of some of the dreams and how they fit into those historical religious types of dreams, and also give some insight into what psychologists and other people from other disciplines have also said about them. But before I go on, I think it's just probably worth saying that although my first study was just in one school, the second large study, as I said, spanned quite a number of schools in Scotland and England. I interviewed the children in schools, which meant that I needed head teacher's permission, and in Scotland you also need the local authority permission first before you can even approach a head teacher. And it was fascinating. The numbers of schools that just said absolutely no way. So there were some in Scotland where whole local authorities just said, no, you cannot go near any of our schools, which wiped out whole massive geographical areas. Despite me, being at one of the best universities in the country at Glasgow. What was also interesting was that when I moved to the areas that had high Muslim populations, the Muslim adults incredibly welcoming, because it's so embedded in the teaching of the Quran, and the Prophet Muhammad himself was said to interpret his companions' dreams on a regular basis. They were fascinated by it. And after parental consent, you can see how numbers start to disappear. Then you need parental consent, and then you need the children's consent. But you can't approach the children unless you have all those adult gatekeepers. And yet the children were so enthusiastic about it. But in so many cases, you just can't get to be able to ask asked the children. Let's have a look at some. So the first type of dream then, we mentioned auditory message dreams. So these are dreams in which the child or adult hears it spoken. So Halima, a Muslim girl, was going to go on holiday with her parents, and they were going to have to go on a long car journey to get there. And she was really nervous about being car sick. And things like this are very important to us, because what we, as adults, don't think are big issues, for children, they can be, and children can really worry about them. And as Carl Jung said, some of these big dreams usually happen during times of crisis or worry, etc., even if it doesn't sound traumatic to us as adults. So Halima was really worried about this long car journey. And she had a dream one night that her aunt appeared. And in the dream, she saw herself in the car with her family, driving down the motorway. And her aunt said to her, "Don't worry, the holiday will be really nice." So it's a very simple dream, as most of the examples I'm going to give you are. And that's also important because we mustn't dismiss it just because it sounds like an ordinary dream, that psychologists would say, well, Halima was clearly worried, so it was kind of linked to her anxiety, and it was a way of coping, having this message that it will be all right. Now, there was then no divine element that in that dream that would be apparent to you or I. So the important point is that if the child wants to talk about it, this is where we get insight into how they're thinking. So I said to Halima, well, you've said on your questionnaire that this was a dream that was connected or had come from Allah. Can you tell me why you think it had this divine origin? And she said, well, it must have come from him because Allah always helps you if you need it. So for her, the dream also helped show or helped give her reassurance of that personal relationship with Allah, that he knew that she was worried about something that might sound quite trivial to other people, but he gave her this dream where her aunt gave her the message. So she felt much better afterwards. The next one, a visual symbolic dream. I noticed that one of Pauline's children wrote the word courage, and again this was the word from Anne, who was 11 years old, a message of courage. So this dream again, slightly unusual, this one, because it doesn't seem to tell a story like most of our dreams appear to. Anne's dream was this. She said, it was all dark and I heard voices. They were my friends' voices, and they were saying, look over there. And I looked over there and I saw a small light. And it got bigger and it turned different colours. It turned red, and then it turned white, and then it turned purple. And it got bigger and bigger, and it took up practically the whole of the dream. The whole space of the dream. Okay, so it was effectively a picture. Now, again, I said to her, now, you've given me this as a dream that was related to God in some way. Can you explain it? So she told me the backstory. So Anne was one of these girls in the marginal Christian category. Her family weren't particularly religious, but they'd sent her to Sunday school, and she was quite enjoying going to Sunday school. But she was also slightly embarrassed about going there, because she knew that if she went into her school and told her friends that she was going to Sunday school, that they would probably pick on her and make fun of her. So she didn't really tell anybody. Now at Sunday school, the vicar had been slightly worried that there weren't many children coming. And he was nervous it was all going to close down, really. So he was saying to the children, can you please encourage your friends to come? We need more people to come. And Anne enjoyed Sunday school and she wanted to get more of her friends to come. But that nervousness that she might get picked on and bullied by her peers if she admitted that she was going made her really nervous. And then she said, and I had this dream. And she said, I thought it was God sending me a message, and it was a message of courage. And I said, well, can you explain that a bit more? She said, well, you know, I said the light in the dream was little, and then it got bigger and bigger. She said, well, I think the light is Christianity, but it's my Sunday school. And if I get more friends to go, then Christianity is going to get bigger. And God showed me that by the colours filling up the whole space of the dream. And then she said, actually, I have this dream more than once. She said, I've had it a few times, which is what psychologists call a recurring dream. And it's always exactly the same. So I said, well, if God's given you this message through a dream, why does he keep sending it to you? And she said, he keeps sending it to me again and again to make sure I don't forget that I need to tell people to go to Sunday school. So again, from a dream that if someone told you that, a child told you that, just literally the content of the dream, you might not think anything of it. But through that conversation and dialogue with her, we found quite profound and almost, and I would say for all of the children, this kind of natural ability to understand, interpret their own dream. And they didn't come from families really who sat down and talked about dream interpretation. Very, very few of them at all. It just seemed as if it was something they did naturally. Now, in the Bible then, for example, some of those dreams, such as the dream of Pharaoh about the famine, were warning dreams. And again, we see these historically. That sometimes people believe that the divine have sent them a dream to give them a warning. So this was a dream by a girl called Rebecca. She dreamt that she was walking past a house that had a red door. And she was with her friend. And in the dream, the red door opened and Rebecca went in and then found herself separated from her friend. Again, a very, very short 2-sentence dream. What happened was that Rebecca's friend it turned out a couple of months later, Rebecca's friend and her family were going to leave the area. Something like that, of course, for a child can be very, upsetting with their friend leaving. Because they, as in the dream, were going to be separated. And Rebecca said that she thought afterwards, so not particularly at the time, but she looked back on the dream a couple of months afterwards when her friend had moved away. So she looked back and she said, and God sent it to me because he was sending me a message that she was going to go. So she felt that God was preparing her with a warning that your friend is going to move away. But she said that that dream helped her come to terms with her friend moving away, which and helping is a key theme of lots of these children's dreams, that the divine are helping and looking after them. We will, though, also touch on, as Pauline said, the darker side of these kinds of dreams later. So, precognitive dreams, these to me are just absolutely fascinating. So they are dreams that people believe are predicting the future. Now, the literature on precognitive dreams, largely from psychology, is quite fascinating, and again largely focuses on adults' dreams, but I'll tell you a little bit of background about them. So with every kind of major world disaster that happens, there seem to be, or there always are, reports by people, usually adults, that they have had dreams which predicted these events. So around the sinking of the Titanic, there are people who reported having dreams that the ship was going to sink. There are many reports from around the time of the 9/11 Twin Towers disaster. There are many about aeroplane crashes, about natural disasters. And of course, what they do is they do flag up methodological problems. And, you know, you could talk for hours about those. So ones that seem to be more robust, of course, are where there's evidence that people have reported these dreams, written them down or told someone before the event actually happens. But of course, there's also problems that they can be so kind of vague. So an aeroplane crashing could be any aeroplane, any airport, anywhere. And psychologists have to look very carefully to see, was there enough detail in that dream to make it kind of credible. Other research has shown that children and young teenagers tend to have more of these precognitive dreams than adults, and it's almost as if that ability starts to get lost after the younger teenage years. And their dreams are often of very ordinary, everyday events, rather than those big Titanic type dreams. So we have the psychologists looking at them, some very sceptical, some just saying it's just coincidence. But for me, I think it's important, it's the impact on the person who's had that dream, whether they think it really was a dream of the future. But of course, as I said, for example, in relation to Pharaoh's dreams, there's also an argument that these can be messages from the divine, warning dreams, perhaps. So some of those did come through in my studies with children as well. So here's an example from Ahmed, a Muslim boy. Ahmed lived in a road which was on a hill. And in his waking life, he would get on his bike and he would often he'd ride down the hill quite regularly. And there were trees down the road as well. So his dream was as follows, and again, incredibly short. He said, I was riding on my bike down my road in the dream, and suddenly there was this tree in front of me, and I had to slam my brakes on to stop before I hit it. Then he told me that 2 or 3 days later, he left his house, he got on his bike, he went down the hill, as he often did, but this time he nearly crashed into a tree. The dream kicked in, he slammed his brakes on, and he stopped before hitting the tree. So I said to him, So why did you tell me this dream then when I'd asked about dreams which Allah might have sent? Why do you think Allah sent that dream to you? And he said, only Allah knows the future. So for him, his interpretation of his dream was that, again, it wasn't just that Allah was sending him a message to, this is a warning dream, I'm predicting the future, you need to slam your brakes on, otherwise you're going to have an accident and hit that tree. It was much more profound than that for Ahmed. It was about his personal relationship with Allah knowing what he was doing every day, and Allah trying to protect him. So if we move on to a slightly different topic, dreams of the deceased, and I'm sure many of you will have had dreams of loved ones who have passed on. You're probably aware that psychological theories have come up about the different stages of grieving, that we go through various processes until we can accept the death of somebody who's passed. And often in those stages, there's a sense of denial that they've really, and a kind of bargaining that we try to say, they can't really have died, I'll do anything if it's not true, and so on. But some work by some American colleagues, particularly Patricia Garfield and Deirdre Barrett, have studied dreams of the deceased. They found that the processes of grieving that we go through in waking life are also mirrored in our dreams. So common examples you may have experienced yourself are of dreaming about the person who's died. If they've been disfigured in an accident or something horrific, some of those appearances and the horrors of, say, an accident are quite vivid in the early stages of the dreaming. But as the grieving process goes on, the people in the dream start to lose all the horrific elements of any accidents, and they tend to come back as you remembered them. They usually come back with words of comfort, or again sometimes words of warning, help and support. So often eventually giving great comfort to people through their dreams. And of course, children are no exception either. But again, can give a divine explanation for some of their dreams. So Amy, who didn't have any religious background, told me about a dream that she was on a double-decker bus and she was sitting on the top floor with her grandma. And then Amy got off the bus when the bus stopped, and the bus drove on and her grandma was still sitting on the bus. Okay, so again, very short, very simple dream, but a very meaningful one for Amy. Amy believed that God had sent her that dream to tell her that her grandma was on a journey. But it wasn't a journey, the bus journey into town. Amy believed it was a symbolic bus journey, that her grandma was going to the other side and she was happy and the journey was trouble-free. So again, for Amy, that dream gave her some comfort that her grandma was still alive, but just in spirit. Now, of course, we know how important pets are to children as well. Very, very important. And I met Samantha, who was telling me about her little pet hamster. who her dad had to take to the vets because Hammy the hamster wasn't very well. Her dad had come back from the vets and Samantha had said, you know, how's Hammy? Is he going to be all right? And the dad said, yes. The vet said, he'll be fine, don't you worry. And Samantha said, but I'm not that stupid. So she knew that Hammy didn't have very long to live. But Samantha also had a younger brother and sister who Samantha thought were too young to understand death. Whether they were or not, I don't know. But Samantha was very much taking the role of big sister here and looking after them. And she had a dream. And when children have a dream that God is in, they do tend to largely describe God in that traditional anthropomorphic old man, white robes, beard, sitting on a cloud. And this was one of those dreams. So Samantha dreamt that she saw God in the clouds. And there was a little figure, was little Hammy, the hamster, up there with God. And she said, so Hammy did die, but she said, it makes me feel a lot happier, the dream, because sometimes I feel upset about Hammy's death. But when I think about the dream, I feel a lot happier. But it also helped her explain the hamster's death to her little brother and sister as well. So it gave her that other role. Now, as Pauline discussed, and something I've written a little on before, all these spiritual encounters, whether they're in dreams or whether they're awake, in waking life, there's a kind of danger that we can romanticise everything. And it's all pink clouds and fluffy bunnies, which is a phrase that's often used. But spirituality, of course, as we know as adults, can be very difficult. And it's often through those really difficult times, isn't it, that we can see them as spiritual, whether it's critical illness or whatever. It makes us reevaluate life and come at things from a different angle. And as I've written before, I think it's almost unethical to talk about the really nice, the funny stories that children or adults could tell us that make us smile and make us feel better and give us hope, without being honest and addressing the darker counterpart. And there's a darker counterpart for everything, whether it's, as Pauline said, from the guardian angel to the weeping angel. And of course, in dreams, then it's the nightmare that we need to be talking about. Now, psychologists have shown us that all children have nightmares, particularly around the ages 4 to 6. It's a normal and natural part of growing up. Lots of it to do fears of separation from parents, finding their way in the world, etc. So if we put post-traumatic dreams, nightmares aside, it's absolutely normal that every child has nightmares. And they're really scary. And they're scary for the parents as well, because it will often stop children wanting to go to bed. It completely puts them off. It makes them frightened of going to sleep, which is not healthy. We know how important sleep is for our mental and physical well-being and memory development. And of course, it's hard for parents to console children who are really frightened by nightmares. And Alan Siegel and Kelly Bulkley, who are American dream researchers, Kelly Bulkley, a leading researcher in religious and spiritual dreams, mostly with adults, but that book there was about children. And they find, the aspects of religion can really frighten children. So they talk about a dream by an American girl called Lucy, who lived in a community that had a fair number of Hindu Hindu population. And she knew some of the Hindu priests who would wear white robes. And although they were very friendly and welcoming, Lucy as a young child was quite scared by them, and she used to have nightmares about them. And I did come across some dreams like that as well. So there was one Catholic boy who had terrible, terrible nightmares about the crucifixion. So he'd obviously seen images of the crucifixion, but in his nightmares it was incredibly vivid, and he could see all the blood coming, and it just used to absolutely terrify him. And he was frightened as well that would happen to him, that he would be crucified if he didn't do as he was told. Another boy as well talked about a nightmare of just this immense battle, but with the most vivid kind of sounds of gunfire and again visually blood and just absolutely horrible. And that was a recurring nightmare as well. So when I asked him about that, he talked about he thought God had sent it to him because he admitted to being a troublemaker at school and a bit of a bully. So he was quite open and honest about that. And he said that the message God was sending him, he thought, was to say, you need to stop bullying other children and you need to be nicer to them. And he did tell me that he tried very hard after having these nightmares to be nicer to other children. And that example, even though it was a nightmare, I think represents the potential transformative power of these spiritual dreams, in that they can potentially make people think differently, and it can make people act differently, and children are no exception. That occasionally, if they have one of these very vivid dreams, particularly if they think it has a divine connection, it can make them change or try to change their behaviour if that's important, or it brings them this great sense of peace, particularly if it's a dream of someone who's died but they come back in the dream. And it gives them that bigger sense of how they help to find meaning and purpose in life, which is at the core really of spirituality. So it helps them make sense of a death, for example, or other events that they can't actually explain themselves. So if we go back to the original statistics, which seem to suggest that maybe about 1/5 of children have had these kind of dreams. And you might be thinking, well, I don't know any children that have ever had a dream like this. Although, of course, you may have yourselves have had one of these dreams yourself when you were a child and may or may not have told anyone. What does come out with research on dreams, but also on children's spirituality more generally as well, is that children are really careful about who they tell. And even children from religious homes often don't have or don't feel that they have someone even at home that they can talk to. I'll give you some. So several said to me, well, I haven't really told anyone, including my friends, because it's just not cool at our school to talk about dreams. So they're very nervous about their peers just making fun of them and not believing them. They've often encountered, particularly at home, that they've told someone and they've said, don't worry, just your imagination. Well, actually, often the children aren't worried in the slightest. It's the parents that are worried. And the parents can be worried. I did speak to one adult once who was really worried that her child might have mental health problems and might be schizophrenic because she was saying that she had communications from God. And it was the parent that was very frightened. And that's, of course, a whole other area of where the boundary is between communicating with the divine and where someone might be deemed schizophrenic or some other psychological condition. So you can understand why parents, particularly if it's a nightmare as well, of course, parents just want to console and say, don't worry. That's completely normal, of course. But by saying it's just your imagination, a lot of children find that very, very dismissive and upsetting. But what children will also say is they'll find the person who does believe them. And they'll go and tell that person. So it might be gran, but never mum or dad, for example. And in the South African study by Potgieter and his colleagues, they cite a girl who was the netball captain, very prestigious in her school to be the captain of the netball team. And she'd gone to the research team to say that she'd had a divine dream. And they said, did you tell anyone about this? And she said, oh, no. How do you think that would affect me as the captain of the netball team? She thought that if people, again her peers, knew that the captain of the netball team was having dreams from God, that would completely destroy her street credibility, as it were, with her friends. So she didn't tell anyone. And I think one of the saddest ones I heard was a young 9-year-old boy, Paul. And he'd had a dream in which he'd gone up to heaven, up into the clouds, and God was sat on a cloud. And Paul was crying and crying and crying. And God had made him feel better. Paul had a very difficult life, very difficult circumstances. So the dream had brought him comfort. But when I said to him, did you tell anyone about this dream, Paul, apart from me? And he said, yeah. I told my cat, he is my only real friend. He always listens and never argues back. And if we don't hear children, presuming that they want to be heard, and I must stress that we must respect the privacy of children who don't want to open up and talk about these things. We must be sensitive to that. But like Sophie, who used to see an angel at the end of her bed, and she told her mum and dad, who just said, just your imagination, Sophie. And she said, never told anyone ever again. And we close children down potentially for the rest of our life, their life, quite often. And I've spoken to adults who tell me things that happened, spiritual things that happened to them in childhood, but they've never told anyone for their whole adult life. And we see this very strange. I mean, David Hay did his study in 1985, and other studies have said that the spiritual and the religious in our culture, particularly in many parts of our culture, I should say, make people just feel nervous about being open. And children say this over and over again to different researchers who are looking at spirituality, that they fear ridicule or dismissal, so they don't tell people. So to finish then, so if a lot of these children are having these spiritual dreams, we have to get the balance right. We don't want to kind of lead children or push children into producing kind of accounts of dreams as well. But we know from anthropologists that these kinds of dreams have been with us for centuries and centuries, across all different cultures, and with some fascinating accounts of how these dreams come about, from the hardcore psychologist who might just give an explanation based on your waking dream content and how your brain's neurons fire and then we impose meaning afterwards, from religious people who may believe these are genuine divine encounters. Some smaller cultures, really fascinating. One of my favourites is a tribal belief in some parts of the world that when we dream, our body stays in the bed and our spirit, our soul, leaves our body and it travels quite literally to the place that you see in your dream. And when that dream is finished, your spirit comes back from that place into your body and you're lying in bed. But children, whatever your personal view of these things are, children, I'm absolutely convinced from a wide range of literature, not just on dreams, but children's spiritual experiences in general, seem to have this innate ability to make some form of meaning that isn't necessarily socially and culturally learnt from their family. And they tune into it, but they learn very, very quickly, usually by around the age of 7, that there are some things in this culture, just don't talk about it because it's not worth the grief that you'll get from peers as well as from adults. So hopefully, if you've never thought particularly about your dreams before as spiritual, hopefully this is food for thought. As I say, very strong roots in religions throughout the world. And if you know any children or have any children around you, treasure them as they take their little steps up to bed each night, because you don't know what's going to happen to them in their dreams. Okay.
Thank you very, very much. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
And what's so good is we've had 3 different talks, and they've linked together.
They have,
each
yeah.
have teased out slightly different aspects. So that's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Has anybody got any questions?
I'd just like to make a small observation. I'm 70 now, and I've only just found a safe space to talk about these things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good news. Bad news, but good news. Yeah. Bad news, you've had to wait so long. Yeah.
And there was a child.
Just an observation, really, that at the beginning of your talk, you placed dreams within the context of religion. Some of you will be familiar, perhaps, with the writings of Giacomo Murco, where he makes the point that spirituality is an innate part of our nature which precedes religion, and religion, as a largely human construct, only comes later in its institutional sense, where we create boundaries. So I would like to place dreams in that wider context.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, very important point.
Oops. I've never said this in public before, although I've mentioned it to friends. I think I probably told my wife, but it was so... when my mother died when I was just turned 21, and I was very close to her because we were born on the same birthday. I was her youngest child. We had a strong affinity. And she was ill. She had cancer. She was a smoker, or like her generation, so she smoked. And then a few years before she developed her cancer, she had a really horrific road crash, which my parents were involved in, a head-on smash. And we feel that I feel that initiated the trauma of that, initiated her cancer. Anyway, she was kind of in hospital, and I knew all about it. And I was going to see her along with my father. from time to time. But she lingered a long time, and my interest ebbed, and I wasn't thinking about her anymore. Kind of, I don't know, just wasn't thinking about it, and I didn't ask to go with my father. And then one night, in the depths of the night, about 4:00 in the morning, I had an incredibly vivid dream. And in my dream, a flying saucer landed. Huge event in my dream, an explosion. It was like an explosion. So the next morning, I'm upstairs, and the phone rings, and my father picks it up, and he starts sobbing. So he's just heard that my mum died that morning, in the middle of the night. Yeah. And so I knew intuitively, of course, but my link, it was like that was the moment when my link with her was cut. I'm not saying it was cut, but it was severed in the physical sense. Now, that was the first aspect. Second aspect was that for a number of nights, after, over a period of a few weeks, I had a lot of dreams of my mum. And in the dreams of my mum, which were incredibly vivid, she didn't know she was dead. She never knew she was dead. She wasn't. She was very agitated and wandering around, but she didn't know she was dead. And then, actually, as it happened, many months later, I went to the College for Psychic Studies, and I had my first interview I'd ever had with a medium there. And the first thing the medium said to me was, I must have told her my mum died, and she said, "Your mum didn't know she was dead." She said, "Your mum didn't know she was dead." And then she went on to say other things about my mum. But about 6 months after my mum died, I had another incredibly vivid dream, which was radiant. It was just full of radiance. And my mother was totally transformed. I felt that, something had happened, something had changed. I've never had another dream of my mum, and that was, she'd gone on, she'd gone on. And occasionally I've had dreams where I'm looking for her and not finding her, but I've never had a, encounter where she was.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
That's just a follow on to what Philip said. My father died very suddenly, just sitting in his chair, of a massive heart attack. He was drinking a cup of tea at the time, and the cup fell, and my mother looked up and discovered he had died. And when I heard that, for some reason, I just was very disturbed by, apart from the grief, I was very disturbed by the fact that he'd gone so suddenly that perhaps he didn't know he had died. And it was my grandmother, who died previously, there to greet him, or somebody else who loved him, you see. So this was in my mind, and I was really quite disturbed about it. And then one day when I was just putting a pixie hood on my 4-year-old daughter, she suddenly said, "I'm dead, I'm dead, I'm really dead." And I knew that had been, she had been the conduit for my father to say that, because she was quite happy. She just came out with that. She wasn't saying, "I'm dead, I'm dead." She just said, I'm dead, I'm really dead," for no reason at all. So I got the message.
That's good. Thank you.
Some of you here know that I'm interested in shamanism or shamanism, and what you said right at the very end about the tribal experience of people lying in their beds and going off on the journey and then coming back, and that's a typical shamanic experience. And to the extent to which shamanism can be willed, as it were, that again is the whole concept of the journey in a meditative state is very much part of the, I'll call it meditative spiritual tradition, which is very powerful. I wrote something in the magazine 2 or 3 years back, and one of the things about the shamanic journey, insofar as one actually does it, is that you actually find it is an act of the imagination, but it's also an act of encounter, and sometimes you encounter, as somebody said the previous talk, that you encounter your your real self and parts of your real self which you didn't know about.
Yeah.
And that brings you in touch with what I would call your creativity. There's all kinds of issues here. We're talking about primal religious stuff, which in this group we dare to talk about and we dare to experience.
Yes.
But most places are very, very suspicious if you talk about these things. And that's, if anybody in the council wants a reason for why you exist, that's what we're here for. We're here to allow ourselves to be brave and discover and tap. Although I'm not going to comment about the talk last night, but the fact that we were able to sit here and talk about teenage witchcraft, as it were, without going, and all that, is a sort of sign that, we are able to, and I think we're richer for that. And again, just being able to get into touch with this primal stuff.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.